The psalm for our Mass today, Psalm 145, has lines in it that I think are the theme for our readings today. And they are, "The hand of the Lord feeds us. He answers all our needs." Now, God, of course, feeds us in many ways. Spiritually, emotionally, physically, psychologically. But today we hear about the only miracle story that appears in all four Gospels: the feeding of the 5,000. And it's preceded by this Old Testament story about Elisha the prophet. And Elisha receives the first fruits of the harvest. Every year the people would bring the first fruits to the temple to be given to the priests and the other workers at the temple. The first fruits were the best of the crop. This year it's a little bit unusual because Elisha says, "Oh no, let's give this food to the people." And perhaps there was a famine at that time. And Elisha was moved by pity to share all that food with the people who had gathered at the temple. And through God's miraculous hand, there was enough to feed them, and some was left over. And don't miss that little detail. God's generosity is always overflowing. There's always something left over. And then we have John's version, feeding of the 5,000 plus, for who knew how many women and children were there also with the men. And Jesus sees them, and his first thought is to take care of their basic need, their hunger. So I imagine, the gospel always has things very compressed and compact, but I imagine Jesus said to his apostles, "Go out there in the crowd and find out how many people have food that they could share." And I also imagine that there were some out there who had been foresighted, who did bring some food. But when the apostles approached them, they said, "Oh no, this is just for us. We're not going to give it to other people." And maybe we would have done the same thing, perhaps. We were the ones that thought of it. They got to take care of themselves, right? But then we have this little boy. This little boy who was an exception. And I think he's the unsung hero of this story. He's the only one who's willing to share what he has with everybody else. I think there's a lesson here for us. I think at times you and I may be a little afraid or embarrassed to share with others something that is a gift of ours because we say to ourselves, "Oh, it's not good enough," or "I'm embarrassed about this," or "I wish I had somebody else's gift." But I think the lesson here is that Jesus will take gladly whatever we have to offer and make something wonderful happen. And so Jesus takes those 5 barley loaves. And by the way, a barley loaf was not very big. Think Frisbee. They were about the size of a Frisbee. And they were about maybe an inch thick. Not very big. So Jesus takes this bread, blesses it, breaks it, and distributes it. And if that sounds familiar to you, it should. What does the priest say at every Mass? When supper was ended, he took bread, blessed it, and broke it, and said, "Take and eat, all of you." So John does not have in his gospel a formal institution of the Eucharist at the Last Supper like the other Gospels do. But we see the institution of the Eucharist here today. And this sixth chapter of John, this is just the beginning we heard today. For the next several weeks, we're going to hear more about what this bread of life means to us. So all are fed, all are satisfied, and as in the story from 2 Kings, there is a lot left over. And I imagine maybe Jesus took those 12 wicker baskets and gave them to the little boy to reward him for his generosity. So that day the hand of the Lord fed people and responded to their need. But this story is more than just a repetition of 2 Kings. This story is about the compassion of Jesus, who yearned to feed people, not just physically as he does today, but spiritually. And Jesus, of course, would go on to give them and us his own body and blood, his very self, to bond himself to us in the most intimate and life-giving way. But just like a body gets sick if it doesn't get food frequently, our souls get sick if we don't feed them regularly. So this is one of those sacraments that we receive over and over for that reason. Now I imagine there were some on the mountain that day that came because they wanted to see a sign. Maybe they were bored. They wanted to be dazzled. They'd heard that Jesus was a wonder worker, and they came to see something wonderful. And maybe later they went home with full stomachs, but perhaps they hadn't been changed very much inside. And then there were some who were very impressed. So impressed that they said, well, if he can do this with bread and fish, he ought to be able to throw out the Romans too. And he wanted to make him a king. But Jesus would have no part of that, and so he fled. But there were some that day who were profoundly changed by what happened. And I imagine that little boy was one of them. They would remember that meal on the hillside for the rest of their lives. They would listen to that itinerant rabbi, and his words would fill them with hope for a whole new way to live for themselves and their families. Those words would give them a new way to relate to each other in peace and forgiveness and thanksgiving, and would go on to enliven them in many ways, in unexpected ways. So they would follow this rabbi, this one who had touched them so deeply that day on the mountainside. But what about you and me? For God feeds us too, in many, many ways. And isn't it true that we're often too busy, too burdened, have too much on our schedule to appreciate all the ways that he feeds us? But like that crowd on the mountainside that day, we have the opportunity at every moment to allow ourselves to be transformed, to allow our faith to be deepened. God certainly is aware of all the ways that we need to be fed. So at this time in my life, I have a great need for good books, good spiritual books, great music. I like to hear, and I have a need to hear, good preaching. I need time with my family, my friends, to deepen my relationship with them. And I need time to be alone for prayer. But what about you? What are your needs? How do you want God to feed you today?